Now let's get started with something that many of you will find extremely useful, and it's one of the biggest things that you're still gonna learn in Solidity besides the stuff that we already learned, and that is mappings and structs. Now I wanna start with mappings, and the reason is because many people will start now to create arrays, and arrays are not exactly the best thing to store a lot of data in Solidity. And there's actually a better way, and that is mappings, and they very much work like hash maps. Now, before talking too much, let me give you an example of how that actually looks like. I'm gonna create a new smart contract over here. Just select the folder, either click the little icon or new file, and then just call this sample mapping sol. Now, of course, we can bring over our SPDX license identifier and also the pragma line. It doesn't really matter. It can be 814, 815, doesn't matter. Contract example mapping. Okay. Now, how's a mapping working? Mapping is mapping a key type to a value type. Let me give you an example with a Boolean. So we can map maybe an unsigned integer to a Boolean, make this public and just call this my mapping. And then maybe just set something, like we set a value to true. The rest of the values are false. Let me show you how that works. We just write a getter function, setter function, maybe set value, some index, and then we set my mapping for this index to true. All right, everything is compiled. If it isn't, then obviously check the checkbox auto compile here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Why is this so small again? Okay, and let's go over to the deploy and run transactions tab and deploy the smart contract. What we have here in our contract instance is two functions, one set value and one my mapping. Now, my mapping has already an input field here. So it expects a parameter, and the parameter it expects is the key, an unsigned integer, and it gives you back a Boolean value. Now for the Boolean, for the key 0, it's going to be false. For the key 1, it's going to be false. This works very much like an array, just with all possible unsigned integer values already initialized with the default value of the Boolean. Now, if you're going to set one of the values, let's say we set the key 2 to true, then number 1 will still be false, but 2 will be now true. So this is how you can work with mappings and store basically a lot of values inside a variable in Solidity. Let's create another one. Let's create an address to Boolean mapping. Address type to bool type public my address mapping. And this can also be, for example, maybe a whitelist. So where you whitelist certain addresses that they're allowed to do something, maybe depositing or withdrawing, or maybe the bool type is not a, maybe you don't map address to bool, maybe you map address to a certain withdrawal amount that people were withdrawing already. So let's just write a setter function for this as well. Function set my address to true. And let's set our address to true. That is stored in message sender. I think you remember that. My address mapping, message sender is true. So now when we are calling this function, right now for our address, if I copy my address over here into my address mapping, it says false. But if I hit set my address to true, then automatically it will take the message sender, which is my address, and then, well, set the Boolean to true. So now I click that one, and now I click the other one. Now it's true. It's still false for the other addresses. So if I go on to the other address, don't really have to go back. If I copy that address over here, it's false. So no matter, I'm still with my first address here. No matter how many times I call set my address, it will always be false for the other one, unless the other address is going to call set my address to true, and then it's going to be true for that address as well. Now, obviously, there is the functions missing to actually go back to false and so on. So what is important to understand is that when you want to access a mapping, then you have kind of the same syntax like you would access arrays, just that all possible combinations of the key type are already initialized with the default value of the value type. Also, the public keyword here will create a getter function again in Solidity. That's like the normal thing that we saw before with normal variables. So with one difference, it will automatically create a parameter for the key type over here. So you're actually fetching one unsigned integer index or key, and you get back a Boolean for that key. So it's basically the same. If I want to create a getter function for the my mapping, what internally happens, and I'm going to write this, but it gives an error because the function cannot be the same name as a variable. But what internally happens is it creates a function with the name my mapping, and this one will have an unsigned integer key or something, and it will be public. A view function returns a Boolean, and this returns my mapping key. This happens internally with the public visibility specifier over here for the variable. Okay, let's remove this again. Now, one last concept that I want to show you is mappings of mappings. Now, you are not limited to value types, to normal simple data types over here. You can actually create another mapping that maps to something else. So for example, if I create a mapping from uint to another mapping, uint to bool, then I have something like a uint bool mapping. Let's make this public. And if I want to write this value over here, then I would write a function set uint bool mapping, and then I have uint key one or index one, uint key 2, and a bool for the value. Public, and then we can write to uint bool mapping, and then write key 1, key 2 is the value. So this would be how you would access those variables inside a mapping of a mapping. And you can do that, like you can nest a lot of mappings together. What I've seen in practice is usually 2 mappings for something like balances in token contracts or allowances. Yeah, it's pretty much that's as complex as it gets in the real world out there. Maybe votings for governance contracts and so on. This is where stuff like this is usually used. But still, before you actually now go out and write mappings of mappings, stay tuned for one of the next lectures where we talk about structs, because that can come in a lot more handy before you create a lot of mappings. That's actually where it gets really powerful. So before we go to structs, I want to go through one more example of mappings, and that comes in the next lecture.